Greetings fellow Mist Wanderers, my name is Steve Morgan and this is DM of the Mists, covering all things Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft. I've done quite a few Ravenloft NPCs now from the Mist Wanderers section, people like Esmeralda Debonair, Franz Alhonen, Jan the Sunstar, main man himself, Dr van Richten, and the Weathermay Foxgrove twins. And this time I thought I'd tackle the great detective Alanik Ray and his sidekick slash partner, Dr Arthur Sedgwick. I run a 5th edition game. I came into D&D and discovered Ravenloft through 5th edition, so I will be talking about the 5th edition version of Alanik and Arthur. Bear in mind there's been a few changes made to them, but I do like to borrow a lot from pre-5e lore and resources, and so I'll be talking about a few things from those as well. If you've seen my Dementlieu video I put out a few months ago, to be honest with you, I talked about Alanik and Arthur a lot there. I'm hoping that there's some more information in this video beyond what was in that video, but if you've seen that video, then hopefully there's a bit more, we'll see. But there will be some crossover and possibly I'll be repeating some stuff that was covered in that video. I suppose I wanted to still cover it in here in case someone discovered this video before the Dementlieu video. I didn't want to just say, oh, just watch the Dementlieu video necessarily. I wanted to kind of have this video be dedicated all about Alanik, even if it repeats a bit. I had this video in mind for a while, and then I was inspired by a recent post someone put on the Ravenloft subreddit saying, who is Alanik Ray, the great detective? And there was a fantastic in-detail comment from a user called Aguzov, assuming that's how that's pronounced. So kudos to them. That kind of gave the kick that I needed to get this going and get this video done. And what I'll do as well is I'll leave a link to that post in the description for anyone who wants to check out that post and the answer there, which was fantastic. Sources of information, well, the obvious one is Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, which has some information about the two of them, primarily Alanik, and things like their personality trait, bond, flaw information, all that jazz. And the Ravenloft Mist Hunters, that's the Adventurers League stuff. He appears in all of them, I think, or at least is mentioned in them. He's sort of like the main quest giver in each of the modules. There's a bit of information about Alanik in there, and he does actually appear in a few of them more properly and is actually there, present himself. There's an old, I believe, 2nd edition resource called Champions of the Mists. I actually got when I think I was finding information for Gondogal, and then was happy to find that it also has information for Alanik Ray, Larissa Snowmain, and a few other people as well. People who were in the old lore, but then some of whom have been carried across into the 5th edition lore as well. And that has some handy information from some kind of items he had, which I'll talk about later when I talk about what I added to his stat block. Ravenloft Gazetteer 3 has some artwork for him, some more information. I didn't know about this until researching this video, but there's a list of some of the sort of more mundane non-magical items he'd have. I'll mention some of those later. And Mistopedia, always really handy resource, which often, as is classic wiki style, links off to other places and says, this information is from here. And you can get sucked into the sort of rabbit hole of like, right, I need to look at this resource and this resource. And it's just good to get some information about sort of pre-5e Alanik from there as well. I'll do a quick sort of lore overview to give a rough idea of who Alanik and Arthur are. And this is, I'm essentially just sort of summarizing information in Van Richten's Guide and elsewhere. He was raised in Darkon in a wealthy family, and as he grew up he found out his father's business was dodgy, which I believe he had sort of a criminal empire which he helped to sort of stop. He met Arthur and I believe Van Richten as well while in Mordant, and he went to the University of Dementlieu, or at least Arthur did. So before they moved to Dementlieu proper, which I'll get to in a minute, they were in Dementlieu before that. They did move to Darkon for a bit, but were driven out by the Karjat. And there's a great sort of Karjat villain you can introduce later, this kind of like a sort of arch nemesis to Alanik, if you will, which I'll talk about later. But they then moved to Dementlieu, and Dementlieu is where they are in terms of the story, in terms of what Van Richten's Guide says and things like that. In Van Richten's Guide and 5th edition, he has some differences. He's now a wheelchair user, and he's gay as well. Or, well, let's not go into the whole thing of, well, he could be bisexual or whatever. But he's in a, not just a professional relationship, but a personal relationship with Arthur. I don't want to get too heavy on should you or shouldn't you include this if you're used to the old lore. Suffice to say that I got into D&D and Ravenloft through 5th edition. I'm more than happy to use the 5th edition changes they made and the 5th edition version of him. 2 of my players are LGBTQ as well, so any additional LGBTQ representation I can add is a plus and a win in my book. I guess if people grew up with Ravenloft and were used to the old pre-5th edition version of Ravenloft, Maybe I'll talk about this more in another video and talk about this properly, but I think it's one of those things where if that's the case, maybe it's okay to use the old version. It is D&D. I said this in another recent video. We are the gods of our campaigns. We can change whatever we want. And I think, though, because I came into D&D as a 5th edition, I'm more than happy to use the 5th edition version of him, but could understand if someone was used to an older version of him, if they wanted to sort of use the old version. I think that's fine. There's art in a few places for him, not only in Van Richten's guide, which is awesome art of him in the middle of shooting an evil sentient toy. That's pretty cool. There's the art for him in Ravenloft Misthunters, which I think is really cool. And there's some art of him, well, the two of them, not just Alanik, Arthur as well, and the Weathermay Foxgrove twins in the new Player's Handbook that came out in 2024, where they are fighting off monsters in the middle of Castle Ravenloft. So that's awesome. I also discovered someone made a map of Alanik's home. I think it's nicknamed, or maybe it's called Alanik Chateau. It's detailed in Ravenloft's Misthunters, and there's more in-depth detail about sort of the sights and the smells and the sort of senses of his home / office in 2 of the Misthunters modules, in number 3 and number 9. So you don't necessarily have to buy all of them, or if you already own those ones, you should have the information in there. I double checked. In some of the modules, I think it talks about his chateau, or it sets it up that the players start off in his chateau, but there's no information about it. But I think in those 2, it's definitely included. And the map looks great as well. I can't remember if I showed it to my players, but it was good at least to have a mental note of how it looked and stuff. And if combat ever were to break out, like someone attacks Alanik and Arthur at their home, then it's great to have that. In terms of roleplay, I'll keep this brief. As far as I was concerned, I just modelled them on Sherlock Holmes and Watson. They are essentially, I don't think anyone's going to tell me I'm wrong saying this, but they kind of strike me as Ravenloft's answer to Sherlock and Watson. I guess I played Alanik as a bit more intense, and they're sort of almost a bit like, how to describe it, like when he's in investigation mode, maybe the cogs are turning, and he's a bit more intense and he's got the goal at hand. I played Arthur as more, I don't want to say friendly, because I think Alanik would be friendly and polite, and he grew up as a noble. Alanik would also be friendly, but I think Arthur's probably more approachable, a lot warmer. Friendly in that regard is probably what I mean. And there was a cool point of information, I think this is from the Old Law, that Alanik, because he grew up in a rich family, if they have to go to parties such as the Grand Masquerade in Dementlieu, Alanik is used to that, he's fine in that, maybe he even excels in those kinds of environments. But Arthur, it said, the information I saw said that Arthur's a little more uncomfortable and probably feels a bit like a fish out of water. So I don't think it goes as far in any of the lore, 5e or otherwise, about Arthur's background and who he is and where he's from and things like that. But it kind of struck me that you could maybe homebrew this and, he's a bit more of a blank slate, but maybe he comes from a poorer background, and you've got the dynamic there of, the rich man and the poor man falling in love and becoming life partners as well as business partners. There could be a quite cool thing to do. And I didn't know about this when I ran the Grand Masquerade. I think I just had them both just there and didn't have it that Alanik was fine and Arthur was uncomfortable, but that could be something you might want to play around with. I think it would create quite an interesting dynamic, especially in those kinds of environments. Stat block wise, Van Richten's guide says use the spy stat block as a base. With Arthur, I mostly just used that. I just used the spy stat block as it is. Said he had a short sword, which I think you can kind of see in his art, and a crossbow, and jobs are good. Since then, I've realised he's a doctor. And I think I got this when I talked about my NPC video where I talked just about Rudolph Van Richten. There's somebody, Guild Bounty, his name is, on Reddit, who suggested giving Van Richten the healer feat, where he can use healer's kits to restore health. And I think that's a good idea. Although ironically, Van Richten is probably less needed because he's got healing spells. But for Arthur and Alanik, without magic and without healing spells, having that I think would be really essential in their line of work. So I can imagine giving Arthur the healer feat and then maybe lugging around a few healer's kits as well is pretty much a necessity for the 2 of them. Alanik I had a lot more fun with. I used the spy stat block as a base, but I gave him some things and I changed some things. So I gave him Eyes of Minute Seeing, which is suggested, I think that was in the Champions of the Mist resource. And that means I think he gets advantage on investigation checks, makes sense in his line of work. Because he's an elf, I gave him the Fey ancestry traits, so things like magic can't put him to sleep, advantage on saving throws against being charmed. Again, in Champions of the Mist, he has a magical dagger, which is called Golden Fang. I think in Old Lore it's a +4 dagger. I think in 5th edition it goes up to, the highest is +3. So I made it a +3 dagger, not a +4 dagger. And I replaced that I had that instead of the short sword. And instead of the crossbow, I gave him a pistol, because in the art, you see him wielding and shooting people with a pistol. There are some other items I found that he has while researching this video that I didn't include. He has a hookah of truth. This is from the old lore, and apparently it works like a zone of truth spell, so that's really cool. He has a hat of disguise. Now, I didn't give him this on purpose. I think even though I knew about this, because Van Richten has a hat of disguise, and I thought if Van Richten or all of his proteges have that kind of thing, it's a bit much. So I just omitted that. Maybe, or another version is that he had it and just didn't use it. But that could be something to consider giving him if you want him to have that, or maybe if you don't run Van Richten, or you don't run Curse of Strahd, or you don't use the Curse of Strahd stat block for Van Richten, you could consider giving it to Alanik as well instead. I found out recently that in Gazetteer 3, I think it says that he has the Eyes of the Eagle, which gives him perception, advantage on perception checks, and it means he can see really far into the distance as well. Weirdly, and I don't think I mentioned this in my Folkovnia video, but I'm pretty sure I gave that to Gondogul in Folkovnia, so I think that was probably another reason for me not to include it, but still. In Ravenloft Mist Hunters at one point when I was flicking through to just double check the information about Alanik, there was something about an anti-charm tonic, and then I didn't find more information. That's on me though, that's because I didn't want to have to read through like 14 or however many modules there are just to try and find out a tiny bit of information. But if for those of you more familiar with it, you might want to dig into that a bit deeper. And it also raises the question of, does he have other potions, other tonics, other elixirs? He probably would do. At the very least, he probably has some potions of healing, for example. And in Gazetteer 3, it mentioned that he has some just non-magical mundane items such as a magnifying glass, lockpicks, a book where he makes notes about cases. Obviously, that's probably a necessity and an essential and obvious thing you would have. So that's quite cool as well. And where would people find him in the Domains of Dread? Well, obviously, Dementlieu. That's where he's living at the moment, and probably where he mostly operates from. Mordant is where Arthur's from, ? Or at least that's where he met Arthur, and potentially the two of them received training from Van Richten. So maybe they revisit Mordant or have a reason to go to Mordant, and he could be found there. Darkon could be a good shout, because that's obviously where he grew up. Maybe they have to return to Darkon for some reason. Talk more about that when I talk about adventure ideas near the end of this video. At the end of the day, I think the Mist Wanderers, hence the name, Mist Wanderers, are meant to wander around and could be placed anywhere. So those are just a few ideas, but if you wanted to put them in any domain, I think you can probably find some reasonable justification to do that. They are suggested investigators in House of Lament, so that could be an option as well. And could they even be in Barovia? Well, I'll talk about this near the end of the video, like could you place Alanik or Alanik and Arthur in Curse of Strahd? I'll talk about that near the end. How things played out in my campaign. Usually I spend a fair bit of time when it came to people like Esmeralda and Van Richten, but spent a good sort of 5-10 plus minutes saying about this is what happened when this is how my players met them, this is what happened during the events of the Curse of Strahd and then the wider Ravenloft campaign. To be honest with you, rather than repeat what was in the Dementlieu video, it makes sense to just usher you to the Dementlieu video, because that's where I talked about it mostly. But as a very high level recap, they went to Dementlieu to track down a vampire who, long story short, they've got the magic item Luba's Talker of Souls, and a bad side effect of that magic item is that monsters can escape. And when they're in the Sea of Sorrows, they used the item and a vampire escaped. And I kind of have a system for figuring out where it might have gone. And I realised that it probably went in the direction of Dementlieu. Sea of Sorrows' borders were open at the time, and so it escaped Sea of Sorrows, ended up in Dementlieu, and is causing chaos in Dementlieu. And when they found that out, they went to Dementlieu, and they have Jennifer Weathermay Foxgrove as an ally of theirs travelling with them, and she said, oh, I know Alanik and Arthur, maybe we should chat with them. So they went to Alanik Chateau, met Alanik and Arthur, through Alanik and Arthur met Chandler Sunstar, and they explained about the Grand Masquerade, and there was a theory that the vampire would probably go somewhere like there and challenge Sidra for rule of Dementlieu. And then they had to try and score an invite, and I talk about this in the video. They defeat a Yoklol, which in the Red Widow Theatre, they fight and defeat the Midnight Slasher, who, full disclosure, I made a mistake, and I think that's a serial killer in Darkon, but I got confused and thought it was a serial killer in Dementlieu, so I just ran with it and said that the Midnight Slasher was in Dementlieu, and did a whole bunch of other things. And then they got an invite to the Grand Masquerade, and Alanik and Arthur went with them to try and locate the vampire and defeat the vampire. And that was pretty much it. And then they left Dementlieu to do other things. And they knew that if they ever went back to Dementlieu, they could see Alanik and Arthur, or check with Alanik and Arthur if they had any quests for them, or what have you. I do have some future plans though. As of my recent Campaign Diary Part 3 video, so they met Savra Sunstar, although she's just called Savra at the time, from Forlorn, and there was a moment where she admits to them that the vampire she's trying to hunt is Janda Sunstar. Now, my players like Janda Sunstar. Through Alanik and Arthur, they met Janda and worked with Janda. And now there's talk that they want to prove to Savra that Janda, the Janda they know, he's a vampire, sure, but he's doing all he can to be a good vampire. He doesn't feed on humans. He tries and fights other vampires, and they defeated the one together at the Grand Masquerade. So they've now got a plan to return to Dementlieu, which probably means they're going to return to Alanik and Arthur as a way to introduce Savra to Janda, and then the plan is to work together to take down Sidra. Now, Sidra is very powerful with her disintegrate ability, and Alanik and Arthur, spice stat blocks are decent, but one bad hit with disintegrate could wipe them out straight away. So they'll probably say they'll not join them on this one, and that it'll just be the PCs, Savra, Janda, and whatever allies they have. But they can obviously give support, they might give ideas, they can use Alanik Chateau as a base. Maybe Alanik will say, oh, maybe we should fight her in the Duchess's estate, and maybe do it when it's not the Grand Masquerade, rather than doing it with like loads of people around who could be in danger of attacks. And also, I have toyed with the idea that maybe Sidra, I didn't do much with the whole, I think she's called the Red Death, and she goes around Dementlieu at night and disintegrates people who are imposters. I didn't do anything with that while they were in Dementlieu the first time. Perhaps when they return to do all this, that's when Alanik and Arthur say, oh, we've been following this serial killer called the Red Death, and people are being dissolved into ash. Maybe this is Sidra's doing. And they can sort of advise with that as well. But it's great. I didn't expect them to go back to Dementlieu. I didn't expect them to go after Sidra. And now that's opened up. And so they'll probably see Alanik and Arthur again when they're there. And one thing I meant to mention during in my campaign bit, because this also happened recently, they're trying to learn more about the apparatus, the special sort of artifact or magical item that's mentioned in a lot of the old Ravenloft lore, and I think in 5th edition as well. I'm going to have it that it's kind of part complete, but not fully complete in Hazlan, which they're going to go to soon. Players don't know about this yet. They know about going to Hazlan, but they don't know about the apparatus is there. But they sent a letter to Alanik and Arthur. They asked one of the Keepers of the Feather to deliver it to him, explaining that they were hoping that he should try and look into the apparatus and get as much information as possible in their absence. But by the time they won't get a reply, they'll probably have discovered it in Hazlan, so we'll see how that goes. Adventure ideas for Alanik and Arthur. Well, there's a few mentioned in Van Richten's guide, and they are potential investigators in the House of Lament, should you decide to do that. There's loads of possibilities. Anything that involves a detective or an investigator. They could be searching for serial killers, whether in Darkon or like I did in Dementlieu. A great enemy you could introduce is Lady Cassandra, who is a member of the Carjat, possibly the leader of the Carjat in older editions. In the current edition, it's Alcio Metis instead. But Lady Cassandra had lost her eye to Alanik, and so she's pretty annoyed about that. And my plan, even though Alcio is the head of the Carjat, I think Lady Cassandra will be the second in command or high up in the Carjat. I love the artwork for her that I found on Mrpedia and also in Gazetteer number 3, both of whom I think are by Talon Dunning, who did a lot of the older Ravenloft art around 3rd edition, I want to say. And Lady Cassandra just strikes me as just a really cool villain that maybe she visits Dementlieu and attacks Alanik and Arthur. Maybe she kidnaps Alanik and Arthur seeks the player's help to rescue him, or vice versa. Arthur's kidnapped, Alanik pleads with the PCs to help. Maybe they have to go to Darkon for some reason and they encounter her there. Maybe they're investigating the disappearance of Aslan Rex, as detailed in Van Richten's guide. So there's lots of things you can play with there. I'd love to hear people's stories of how you incorporate NPCs in your games. So if you're running a Ravenloft game and you had Alanik appear in certain places, please let me know in the comments. Not only is it useful to me, it could be useful to other DMs who see it as well. Love to kind of collectively discuss ideas and share stories of how you've incorporated, or how they, I should say, Arthur as well, incorporated in your games. What about including Alanik and or Arthur in Curse of Strahd? I don't know, it's a tricky one, because you've already got Esmeralda, and I think Esmeralda's great. Part of my reason saying don't include Alanik is because I love Esmeralda. I think it'd be overkill if you had Ez and Alanik in Barovia, and with Van Richten as well. I don't know if Alanik fits the vibe with Barovia. Like, I think he works better in places like Mordant and Dementlieu and places like that, not necessarily Barovia and during the events of Curse of Strahd. I guess for some reason, if you didn't like Esmeralda for whatever reason, you could swap her for Alanik. That could be cool, I guess. I'd love to know if people have actually added Alanik and or Arthur to Curse of Strahd and to Barovia. Be interested to know how you did that and how it went. I can't visualize it working, but maybe, I don't know, you folks tell me if it works and how it went in your game if you did it. And that's it for this one, I think. I don't think there's much more to discuss. I think we've kind of covered all the bases. If I haven't, or if you have any questions, let me know. Upcoming videos. I've toyed with the idea for a long time now of doing a dedicated video about Gondogol. I covered him heavily in my Folkovnia video though, which is one of the reasons I've been putting it off. So if you are hoping to find out more information about Gondogol, then feel free to watch my Folkovnia video in the meantime. But I might do a dedicated video where I expand on, a bit like Alanik with this one. I covered Alanik in my Dementlieu video, but have hopefully added a bit more information for him here. Same with Gondogol. Yes, as covered in the Volkovnia video, but then a dedicated video where I talk about that and more. Maybe do Larissa Snowmain as well, who I haven't added to my campaign yet, but I loved the novel Dance of the Dead, where she appears, she's the protagonist, and do a video about her. She also appears in Champions of the Mists, so if you're looking for information for her beyond Van Richten's Guide and that novel in the meantime, that's a good place to look. In terms of Domains of Dread, I'm just started running Tovag. I don't think that's going to be a long one, a few sessions thing, so hopefully the Tovag video will follow in a few weeks' time, maybe a month or two. And I'd like to do a video as well where I cover the resources for Ravenloft. So one of my first ever videos on this channel was resources of Curse of Strahd, so not just the Curse of Strahd book, but other places where we can get information. Same with Ravenloft, not just Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft and Mystopedia, but there's a few kind of like fan zines and net zines and fan stuff that you can look up, some of which I only discovered recently, despite having run a Ravenloft campaign for 2.5, nearly 3 years now. There's some stuff I'm only discovering recently that might be useful to other DMs, and there's some stuff I've realized doesn't appear in Google. So there's a forum where people talk about D&D, not just Ravenloft, but other things as well. And I realized that for whatever reason, the forum doesn't appear in Google. And so you have to look on there manually and use its own search functionality. You can't rely on Googling it and hoping it'll appear. So that's one that I didn't discover for a long time for that reason. You know, you want information for Alanik Ray, you Google Alanik Ray, you find Mystopedia, you find other stuff. So I think it'd be handy for me to say, oh, there's this, this, and this that you may not be aware of. So hopefully that'll be handy to other Ravenloft DMs as well. Thank you, Mr. Wanderers.